Some weapons roar when they strike. Others whisper and kill with terrifying silence. Long before gunpowder and cannons, the Romans created a machine that hurled death through the air so fast, so precisely, that enemies never knew what hit them. Its bolts could pierce through two men, shatter their shields, and bury themselves deep into stone. It didn't need the chaos of battle to make itself known. Its silence was its terror. Yet today, few can even name it. This is the story of the Roman ballista, the weapon that turned engineering into art and art into domination. The ballista didn't emerge fully formed from Roman genius. Its story began centuries earlier in the intellectual heart of ancient Greece, among mathematicians, tinkerers, and dreamers who sought to blend geometry with warcraft. Before it became the weapon of empire, it was a triumph of science. The Greeks of the classical age were obsessed with proportion and balance. In their laboratories and workshops, they experimented with ways to magnify human strength through mechanical design. Among their most remarkable inventions was the gastrophetes, literally the belly bow. Imagine a crossbow so large that it had to be braced against the user's stomach to be drawn. Crude by later standards, it was revolutionary nonetheless. For the first time, human ingenuity replaced raw muscle as the source of power in warfare. It was, in essence, the first mechanical weapon, storing potential energy not in wood or sinew, but in a system designed to amplify force. In that moment, warfare began to move from instinct to calculation. But the real transformation came in Syracuse, around the 4th century BCE. The city's ruler, Dionysius the Elder, made a decision that would change the course of military history. He hired full-time military engineers. Under his command, Greek craftsmen began experimenting with twisted cords of sinew and horsehair, discovering that these could store far greater tension than any wooden bow. From their efforts emerged the first torsion-powered engines, the direct ancestors of the Roman ballista. These new machines could hurl heavy projectiles at blistering speed, smashing through enemy defenses with ease. For the first time, the balance of power in siege warfare shifted from the wall to the attacker. The battlefield would never be the same again. By the time of Philip II of Macedon and his legendary son Alexander the Great, these weapons had evolved into sophisticated instruments of conquest. The Greeks learned to build lighter, portable versions, the earliest field artillery. During the siege of Tyre in 332 BCE, Alexander's engineers positioned ballistae on mobile platforms, firing precise volleys that cleared defenders from the city's high walls. Ancient historians like Arrian and Diodorus described these machines with awe, engines that could strike a single man at hundreds of meters, their iron bolts cutting through armor as though it were paper. They weren't just tools of destruction. They were the visible proof of human intellect triumphing over brute strength. Still, the Greeks remained limited by their mindset. Their ballistae were rare, cumbersome, and used mostly in sieges. They had birthed the weapon, but not the system to make it dominate the world. That honor would belong to Rome. When Roman legions first encountered Greek artillery in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, among the armies of Syracuse, Macedon, and the Seleucids, they instantly recognized its potential. Rome was not a civilization of inventors. It was a civilization of perfectors. What others conceived, Rome improved, standardized, and weaponized. The Greeks had seen the ballista as a specialist tool. Rome saw it as the future of disciplined warfare. They envisioned an army where mathematics and manpower worked in perfect harmony. Every legion would march not only with swords and shields, but with engines of precision, each one designed, measured, and calibrated for maximum impact. The turning point came during the siege of Syracuse. The Romans, led by Marcus Claudius Marcellus, faced defenses unlike anything they had ever seen, and behind them stood one man, Archimedes. The great mathematician unleashed a terrifying array of machines, catapults, cranes, and multi-range ballistae that devastated the attacking fleet. Plutarch wrote that Archimedes' engines brought ruin upon the Romans with unerring accuracy, striking ships before they even reached the harbor walls. Though the Romans eventually captured the city, the experience shook them. Siege warfare had evolved into a contest of intellect. They had seen the future, and it was mechanical. After Syracuse, the Romans began to integrate torsion artillery into their military doctrine systematically. What began as imitation became mastery. By the age of Julius Caesar, the ballista had become a permanent feature of every Roman campaign. Caesar himself described their use during the siege of Avaricum and at Alesia, where the Roman army built a double line of fortifications bristling with artillery to trap their enemies within and keep reinforcements out. There was scarcely a place left for assault, he wrote, that was not guarded by a battery of engines. But the Romans didn't just use these machines, they philosophized about them. To Rome, the ballista was more than a weapon. It was a manifestation of their worldview: order, discipline, and precision. It symbolized control over chaos. Unlike the unpredictable swarm of arrows, the ballista fired with mathematical certainty. It was war reduced to pure geometry. Soon, lighter variants called scorpions appeared on the battlefield, small, portable torsion engines capable of rapid fire. Naval versions were mounted on warships to unleash barges across the sea. Rome even formed specialized units, the Ballistarii, engineers trained in the construction, maintenance, and operation of these machines. Every Roman marching camp, no matter how temporary, was fortified with artillery emplacements. Wooden towers at each corner bristled with ballistae, ready to repel ambushes or command the field. The late Roman writer Vegetius captured the Roman obsession perfectly when he wrote, "No camp should be considered secure without engines of war at its angles." To the Romans, the ballista wasn't merely a weapon, it was a symbol of Roman identity itself. It embodied calculation over chaos, intellect over instinct. It turned the art of killing into a science. Where other civilizations used their inventions and moved on, Rome made the ballista part of its military soul. It appeared in every major campaign for centuries, evolving in form and efficiency until it became the silent thunder of empire. And though time eventually buried it beneath the dust of history, the principles it embodied lived on. The science of tension, trajectory, and precision would resurface in medieval crossbows, Renaissance cannons, and even modern artillery. Every time a projectile arcs through the air with mathematical accuracy, the shadow of the ballista lingers, a whisper from the ancient world reminding us that behind every empire stands not just power, but engineering. At first glance, a Roman ballista can trick the eye into thinking it's simply a giant crossbow, but that's deception. This was not a scaled-up archer's tool. It was a purpose-built instrument of mechanical precision, crafted to spit death with terrible speed, eerie silence, and almost mathematical certainty. Everything began with the bed, a stout frame of seasoned oak, hewn and bolted to resist the shock of repeated firing. From that foundation rose two massive vertical cheeks, pillars that looked like the shoulders of a hulking statue. Those cheek pieces were more than timber. Each contained a torsion chamber, a tightly wound bundle of sinew or horsehair treated and preserved so it would behave predictably. Salt, vinegar, and careful drying kept the fibers springy and slow to rot. When the machine was cocked, the throwing arms pulled the torsion bundles into ever greater twist. The stored energy was not the bending of wood, but the coiled fury of torsion itself. On release, that energy unwound in an instant, flinging the arms forward with violent torque, rotational force unleashed, not a simple snap, but a carefully timed explosion of motion. The springs themselves sat inside bronze collars, modioli, small washer-like discs that locked the bundles in place and allowed fine adjustments. Expert operators, the Ballistarii, would wind and tweak these with iron rods much like a surgeon turning a dial. Too tight, and the arms risked shattering under stress. Too loose, and the shot would peter out or fly awry. The coils were temperamental. Humidity could make them swell and slacken. Dry heat could shrink them into brittle overtension. Campaigns in varied climates demanded constant attention, rewrapping, retensioning, even replacement, because a misjudged spring was a ruined volley or a dangerous catastrophe. Roman engineers measured machines with the care of architects. The great Vitruvius tells us that dimensions were not guessed but calculated. The size of the torsion cavities, the length of the arms, and the bed's proportions all corresponded to the intended projectile. If you needed a bolt of a certain length and weight, there was a matching engine whose dimensions formed a precise ratio to that missile. This was not artisan guesswork. It was applied geometry, an early engineering standard that let Rome scale engines up or down without losing performance. In practice, it meant parts could be prefabricated, packed into wagons, and reassembled by crews who knew the proportions as surely as a smith knows his hammer. The throwing arms themselves were carved from resilient hardwoods. Ash and maple favored for their tensile strength and ability to endure violent acceleration without splintering. These arms worked like giant levers. Seated in the torsion bundles, they rotated forward rather than being pulled back like a string. Between them ran the canalus, a narrow, smooth groove, also called the slider, where the iron-tipped bolt lay in wait. That groove was the heart of accuracy, a guiding rail that steadied the missile through the first furious meters of flight, preventing yaw and ensuring the bolt left true. Later, more heavily used engines even had metal-lined channels to reduce wear and keep trajectories consistent. To cock a siege-sized ballista required muscle and coordination. A ratcheted winch and pawl, often a wooden capstan with claw hooks, was mounted at the stern. Teams of men hauled in unison, the winch clicking down bolt by bolt until the arms locked. The trigger was a simple but reliable affair, a rotating catch or locking pin that, when withdrawn, let the stored torsion discharge. That simplicity masked everything else. Each machine was essentially a portable laboratory, tuned by instinct and experience. Because Romans treated this technology as a system, not a one-off trick, standardization became central. The same proportions and procedures applied to a compact field Scorpio as to a towering siege engine. Only scale changed, not principle. That consistency made the ballista modular. Frames, coils, bolts, and bronze fittings were packed in measured crates in the legion's baggage train. Across the empire, road by road and ford by ford, pieces could be hauled over mountains or ferried across rivers, then reassembled in a few hours by hands that had practiced the choreography countless times. Those hands belonged to a specialist cadre within each legion, the Ballistarii. They were more than fighters. They were craftsmen, engineers, and artillerymen trained to build, maintain, and operate engines under campaign conditions. These men drilled constantly, rewrapping sinew, aligning grooves, measuring tensions with an experienced eye, so that when an order came, they could put a living weapon back together and place it in service immediately. Their work was overseen by the legion's engineering officers and by manuals of proportion and practice that turned empirical tricks into repeatable knowledge. Seen this way, the ballista was not merely a machine of wood and bronze. It was a technological culture, a convergence of materials science, geometry, logistics, and training. It required forethought in the commissariat as well as skill in the field. The Romans did not treat it as an ornament of war, but as an instrument of control, predictable, scalable, and administrable. That is why in every campaign, the ballista was not only built but cared for, measured, and perfected. The result was a weapon whose deadliness came as much from the discipline around it as from the torsion that launched its bolts. The Romans took it seriously. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the dust of the day began to settle, the Roman legion did not rest in chaos. It rested in geometry. Every evening, without exception, the army constructed a new home, a fortress that could rise from bare earth in under an hour. Ditches were carved, palisades driven, tents aligned in perfect symmetry, and at each corner stood the quiet heartbeat of Roman warfare, the artillery crews, the Ballistarii. Their place was always the same, near the gates or at the cardinal points of the encampment, where open ground gave clear lines of fire. Theirs was not a soldier's tent of laughter and rest, but a workshop of measured silence. There, beneath the fading glow of torches, they uncrated the engines of destruction that had followed Rome across continents, the Ballistae. Each evening, the process was ritual. Frames were checked for warping. Iron bolts were unwrapped from oilcloth. Sinew cords were inspected, twisted, and retentioned with the precision of a harpist tuning before concert. Moisture, wind, and heat were their invisible enemies. A single rainstorm could slacken the torsion bundles, turning deadly power into harmless vibration. So they listened to the air, tested the cords with their fingertips, and adjusted the bronze washers with patient care until the tension sang correctly. Even Pliny the Elder noted that Roman engineers approached their craft like philosophers of mathematics. They calculated load, recoil, and torque as if they were balancing a cosmic equation. For them, a misaligned spring wasn't merely an error, it was a potential death sentence. The machine demanded obedience, and the Romans gave it willingly. To fire a ballista was to conduct an orchestra. It was never the act of one man. Teams of 4 or more moved in rhythm, one to load the bolt, one to crank the winch, one to monitor the tension, and another to sight the target and release. Orders were shouted in precise Latin cadence, echoing across the camp. Parar, intendere, immittere, then silence. The release was almost anticlimactic. A crack, a blur of movement, a whisper of air, and the bolt vanished. No roar, no arching lob like a catapult shot. Just a deadly, straight line that no man could see or dodge. A heartbeat later, it struck, sometimes into wood, sometimes into flesh, sometimes into the very stone of a wall. The only sound was the dull, dreadful thud of impact. This silence was its signature. The ballista didn't announce itself. It delivered death before awareness could form. Ancient observers wrote that soldiers often didn't know they were under attack until the man beside them collapsed, transfixed by a shaft as thick as his arm. 2 millennia later, modern archaeologists and engineers have brought these machines back to life. In the hands of groups like the Manx Street Guard and researchers such as Dr. Peter Vemming Hansen of the Danish Medieval Center, the ballista has been reborn from fragments of text and fragments of iron. Using Vitruvius's precise ratios, they built full-scale working replicas, each beam, each coil, each washer crafted as the ancients described. The results were astonishing. When tested, these reconstructed ballistae hurled iron-tipped bolts weighing up to 10 kilograms with speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. The projectiles struck with such force that they pierced oak planks, tore through layers of shield and mail, and buried themselves half a meter deep in sandbanks. It confirmed what ancient writers claimed. A single shot could kill 2 men standing in line, splinter a tower's door, or tear through a phalanx formation before the enemy even reached the walls. The Romans, of course, had known this all along. They had designed their war engines not for spectacle, but for certainty. Unlike the groaning onagers that flung stones in high arcs, the ballista struck with terrifying silence. It was invisible death. A soldier on the walls might shout orders one moment and fall dead the next, impaled through shield and breastplate. Witnesses compared the effect to lightning, unseen until it hit. At the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the historian Josephus wrote of Roman engines that hurled stones and bolts like thunderbolts from heaven. Some of the stones weighed over 50 kilograms, smashing battlements, tearing men apart, and flinging corpses from the ramparts. The defenders, he said, feared the engines more than the soldiers themselves, for death came without warning, not as battle, but as judgment. Archaeologists have found proof of these accounts. At Masada and Jerusalem, layers of siege debris contain hundreds of heavy projectiles, stone balls the size of helmets, and iron bolts over a meter long, their tips still sharp after 2,000 years. At Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall, smaller iron heads were unearthed, perfectly shaped for armor penetration. The evidence matches Vitruvius's formulas exactly. Theory turned into archaeology, mathematics preserved in metal. The Romans understood that killing wasn't the only power of artillery, fear was. The ballista's range and precision made it not just a weapon, but a psychological engine. In siege warfare, volleys of bolts struck without pattern, breaking the confidence of defenders who no longer knew where safety lay. Cities under siege often fell long before their walls cracked, morale shattered by the unrelenting rhythm of invisible projectiles. Roman engineers even carved Latin taunts into their ammunition. At Masada, one stone ball bears the words "for you." Another found near Jerusalem reads, "Return as sender." These were not jokes. They were psychological warfare, reminders that Rome's vengeance was personal and precise. And the terror was not confined to cities. In open field battles, lighter scorpions and Ballistae acted like ancient sniper rifles. They targeted officers, standard-bearers, and cavalrymen. A single, well-aimed shot could throw an entire tribal army into confusion. Imagine watching your chieftain's chest burst open mid-command, his body hurled backward before he even finishes a word. Rome's enemies didn't just lose men, they lost certainty. Julius Caesar himself made brilliant use of these portable engines during his Gallic campaigns, particularly at Avaricum and Alesia. He stationed ballistae along earthen ramparts and towers, creating overlapping zones of fire. Whenever enemy reinforcements advanced, Roman artillery cut them down from afar, maintaining a deadly curtain that never ceased. Caesar understood what the ballista offered, not brute power, but control. It shaped the battlefield as surely as his legions did. Rome's engineers, ever adaptable, carried the weapon to water. On the decks of triremes and quinquiremes, smaller torsion engines were mounted at the bow, their operators shielded by wooden screens. These naval ballistae could tear through rigging, puncture hulls, or sweep enemy decks before the ships even touched. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian's fleet used ship-mounted artillery to devastating effect. Bolts rained down on Antony and Cleopatra's heavier vessels, shredding sails, breaking oars, and driving panic before boarding even began. Witnesses said the sea shimmered with broken wood and blood long before the ships collided. The ballista had extended Rome's reach from the hills of Gaul to the waves of the Mediterranean, proving that the empire's greatest weapon wasn't the sword, but the mind that aimed it. Even when the bolts missed, they mattered. The sharp crack of release, followed by the dull crash of impact, echoed across battlefields and city streets. Horses panicked, men ducked, formations wavered. In pre-modern warfare, where discipline was everything, the psychological shock of artillery fire could decide victory before close combat began. The Romans didn't need to slaughter every enemy. They only needed to break formation. The ballista did precisely that, controlling rhythm, imposing hesitation, and forcing disarray. Every shot was a reminder. Rome dictated the tempo of battle. As centuries passed and the empire fractured, the knowledge that sustained the ballista faded. The ballistarii disappeared, their manuals lost, their workshops silent. Only fragments survived in Byzantine treatises describing smaller hand ballistae, the Ballistra, elegant but weaker echoes of Rome's perfection. Yet the idea endured. The medieval crossbow borrowed its precision. The trebuchet imitated its principles of calculated leverage. Renaissance artillery revived its science through Vitruvius, whose diagrams inspired men like Leonardo da Vinci to dream of new machines. The lineage of every cannon and sniper rifle leads back, in spirit, to the quiet torsion chambers of Rome. Because the ballista was never just a siege weapon. It was the embodiment of Roman philosophy, discipline over chaos, intellect over instinct, order over fear. When its bolts flew, they carried more than iron. They carried the authority of an empire that believed in geometry as destiny. And so, even today, when we study its form or rebuild its frame, we're not just touching an ancient machine. We're touching Rome's mind, its unyielding pursuit of control through precision. A weapon that whispered across centuries. Power belongs to those who measure it.